gesturing towards Jasmine with a dismissive wave.
Ms. King, actually. No relation to you, of course.
You see, Mr. King was Chinese-American, so Miss Roberts thought there was no way he could be related to her student. She chuckled at her own joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Mr. King's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction.
Is that so? Well, Miss Roberts, I believe we should discuss this matter further, perhaps in private.
Miss Roberts nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal.
Of course, Mr. King. I'd be happy to share my concerns about Ms. King's performance and attitude.
As Miss Roberts began gathering her materials, Mr. King turned to address the class.
Students, please continue with your assigned reading. Will only be a moment.
He then looked directly at Jasmine, a small, reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Jasmine sat up straighter, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in weeks. Miss Roberts, still oblivious to the true nature of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. King followed, pausing briefly at the door to cast one last glance at his daughter. The look they shared was one of understanding and shared strength. As the door closed behind them, a buzz of excited whispers filled the room. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was about to unfold. Jasmine remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that beyond it, justice was finally about to be served. The closed door couldn't muffle the rising voices outside. Miss Roberts' confident tone gave way to stammering confusion as Mr. King's calm authority filled the air. How would the teacher's attitude shift when she discovered Jasmine's true identity? Miss Roberts led the way to an empty conference room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She turned to face Mr. King, a smug smile playing on her lips.
I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. King. I've been quite concerned about Jasmine's performance and attitude in my class.
Mr. King nodded, his expression neutral.
I see. Please, tell me more about your concerns.
Miss Roberts launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment.
Well, for starters, she consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared.
As she spoke, Mr. King's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Miss Roberts to continue her tirade.
And her attitude,
Miss Roberts exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation.
She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits.
Mr. King raised an eyebrow.
And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a racially charged trial?
Miss Roberts faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question.
Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues.
I see,
Mr. King said, his tone measured.
And how exactly has Jasmine been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples?
Miss Roberts straightened, regaining her confidence.
Of course, she constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions. And her body language, the way she sits there, all defiant. It's clear she has no respect for authority.
As Miss Roberts spoke, Mr. King's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm.
Miss Roberts, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking?
Miss Roberts blinked, taken aback by the question.
Well, I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But Mr. King, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her.
Mr. King's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly.
I see. And what makes you think Jasmine's previous education was lacking?
Well, it's obvious, isn't it?
Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with condescension.
The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here.
Mr. King took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface.
Miss Roberts, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Jasmine's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for it.
Miss Roberts frowned, confusion evident on her face.
I don't understand. How could you possibly know that?
Mr. King's eyes locked onto Miss Roberts, his gaze unwavering.
I know because I'm Jasmine's father.
The color drained from Miss Roberts's face as the implications of Mr. King's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant.
You're...
Miss Roberts stammered, her eyes wide with shock and growing horror. Mr. King nodded, his expression grave.
Yes, Miss Roberts. Jasmine King is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her.
Miss Roberts stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the school's principal, and more importantly, to a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave.
Mr. King, I had no idea.
She managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper.
Clearly,
Mr. King replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Miss Roberts flinch.
But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student.
Miss Roberts' mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation.
Mr. King, please, I can explain. I never meant to...
Mr. King held up a hand, silencing her.
I think you've explained quite enough, Miss Roberts. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this, but for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we?
As Miss Roberts numbly nodded and turned to leave, Mr. King added,
Oh, and Miss Roberts, I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand.
Mr. King's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath. As he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Miss Roberts, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults.
Class,
Mr. King addressed the room, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel.
I believe we need to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education.
Miss Roberts stood rigidly by her desk. Her earlier confidence evaporated. She glanced nervously at Mr. King, then at Jasmine, her mind racing to process the revelation she'd just experienced. Mr. King continued, his gaze sweeping across the room.
It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class. Incidents that go against everything our school stands for.
A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Jasmine, pieces of the puzzle falling into place.
Miss Roberts, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students?
The teacher's mouth opened and closed, words failing her.
Mr. King, I never meant to...
Never meant to what, Miss Roberts?
Mr. King's voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack.
Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview?
The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words, precise and cutting, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks.
Let me be clear.
Mr. King continued, his eyes locked on Miss Roberts.
Your behavior towards Jasmine, and I suspect towards other students of color, is not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences.
Miss Roberts attempted to interject, her voice trembling.
Mr. King, please, if I could just explain.
Explain what exactly?
Mr. King cut her off, his patience wearing thin.
Explain how you mocked Jasmine's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes. Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions. Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions.
The color drained from Miss Roberts' face as Mr. King recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. King turned to address the class once more.
Students, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences.
He paused, letting his words sink in.
What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education. It's discrimination, plain and simple, and it stops today.
The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. King's words. Jasmine sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. King's gaze returned to Miss Roberts, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny.
Miss Roberts, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day.
As Miss Roberts gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. King took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more.
I apologize that you've had to witness this, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society.
He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly. Some students looked shell-shocked, others relieved. A few cast apologetic glances towards Jasmine, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. King cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention.
I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment.
As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to Jasmine. Sarah, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again." Jasmine nodded, a small smile of understanding on her face.
Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better.
Outside the classroom, word spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd heard in hushed tones. As Jasmine emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway. Then slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students, then grew until it echoed through the corridor. Jasmine walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Roberts faced the consequences of her actions. The school board was convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Roberts was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, As Jasmine approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves. In the hallways, she overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Jasmine was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Jasmine found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Jasmine felt truly heard and valued. After school, as Jasmine walked out with her father, they passed by Miss Roberts' now empty parking spot. Mr. King squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, Jasmine, what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." Jasmine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school." The events at Westfield High exposed how prejudice can lurk, even in educational settings. Miss Roberts' treatment of Jasmine revealed deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for years. But Jasmine's courage in speaking up sparked a transformation. The school community rallied around creating a more inclusive environment. New initiatives, diversity training, and open dialogues challenged long-held assumptions. Students and teachers alike were forced to confront their own biases and blind spots. Jasmine's journey from victim to leader showed the power of resilience in the face of injustice. Her willingness to turn pain into positive change inspired others to examine their own beliefs and actions.